The Colosseum. You've seen it before. Hell, you've probably seen it 1,000 times without even trying. It's been photographed more times than a Kardashian and written about in enough books to rebuild the great library of Alexandria. So why am I here? What could I possibly say that hasn't already been said by some professor of Roman antiquity or some overeager tourist with a selfie stick? I'm not a scholar. I'm not even an expert on modern Rome, yet alone ancient Rome. And I sure as hell don't have any groundbreaking new facts to drop to you. This could easily become just another video lost in the abyss of YouTube, unfound, unloved, and untouched. But that's not why I'm here. No, instead I'm going to tell you a different kind of story. One that's less about stone and history and more about the people. About the man who's lived through it all, or at least through every version of it. Meet Marcus Valerius Falco, or Mark if you catch him in the modern era. He's a Roman who's seen the Colosseum in all its bloody, glorious and tourist-riddled phases. And he's going to guide us for the next few minutes. We might even learn something new. In the golden days of the Roman Empire, when the Colosseum echoed with the roar of 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators, there was a man who knew every corner of the colossal amphitheater. His name was Marcus Valerius Falco, a man of many talents, soldier, lanista, and on particular chaotic days, a reluctant referee. He wasn't some lofty aristocrat peering down from the emperor's box. No, Falco was in the trenches, organising gladiator matches with the precision of a seasoned general. Every morning Marcus would walk along the long corridors beneath the Colosseum, where gladiators waited nervously for their turn to fight. The smell of sweat, fear and the metallic tang of blood in the air was also familiar to him. His daily duties? Well, beyond ensuring that the gladiators didn't stab each other before their scheduled bouts, he had to deal with the arena of animals, lions, bears, elephants, each one more temperamental than the next. One day, it was making sure that the animals were hungry enough to thrill the crowd, but not too hungry that they'd tear the place apart before showtime. The fine art balance in the entertainment industry. And then there were the politicians, eager to get their names tied to the biggest events. They'd approach Falco with bribes, promise him a fortune for a little extra flair in the day's schedule, maybe a gladiator match with an unfair twist or two. He'd listen, smile, take the bribes, and then because he had a reputation to uphold, do whatever he wanted. The Colosseum was his after all. The real battle wasn't on the sands of the arena, but in the political dance behind the scenes. Marcus was clever, though always a step ahead. He played the long game, keeping both the politicians and the crowd entertained. But it wasn't all blood and politics. Marcus had a strange fondness for the gladiators, men and women, who had no real chance at a peaceful life. After all, wasn't he, too, just another cog in the Empire's bloody entertainment machine? He walked the sands after the fights, the cheers of the crowd fading, and stared at the night sky through the open arches. A man could get lost in the weight of it all, knowing that he was both part of history and trapped by it. His biggest challenge, though, wasn't the gladiators or the animals or the politicians. It was the crowd. They always wanted more, bigger fights, more blood. He'd organised the events to the last detail, but no matter how grand, how dangerous the spectacle, there was always tomorrow. A tomorrow would need something even more spectacular. There was no room for failure. The masses weren't coming for half measures. But somehow, Marcus always found the way to top himself. When he wasn't managing the games, he was plotting the next spectacle, wondering if there'd be a day when even he couldn't keep up. Yet, in his heart, he knew the truth. Rome's appetite for blood was insatiable, and the Colosseum was nothing more than a reflection of the city's darkest desires. It's the 16th century, and the Colosseum is no longer the stage for brutal games of life and death. Now it's a crumbling relic, a monument to the Empire's faded glory, but even in ruin it commands the awe of people. And at its centre stands Marco Valerio Falcone, a man who has somehow lived through the rise and fall of Rome, not just in the metaphorical sense, but quite literally. In Renaissance Rome, Falcone is no longer an organiser of gladiator games. Instead, he's a scholar and artist, blending seamlessly into a world obsessed with rediscovery. These days he's dressed in a simple tunic, carrying a satchel filled with parchment, charcoal and half-baked ideas. His daily duties are far more academic than his previous life. He spends his time sketching the decayed grandeur of the Colosseum, obsessing over every crack and broken arch, trying to capture what once was. Marco doesn't just see ruins, he sees memories. Ghosts of gladiators still linger in the corridors, lions pacing in their cages. The place whispers to him, just like it did centuries ago. But life as an artist in Renaissance Rome is hardly easier than being a lanista. The challenge now is convincing patrons, wealth and Medici type, with too much gold and too little imagination, that the Colosseum is worth saving. Most people are using it as a quarry, stripping stones for palaces and churches. Marco stands there watching as chunks of his past life are carted off to build some banker's summer home. His biggest nemesis? Bureaucracy. The endless tangled mess of Renaissance politics makes even the Roman Senate seem efficient. Marco spends half his time trying to navigate the web of commissions and approvals to save the Colosseum from further destruction. His arguments are passionate, laced with historical references that make eyes glaze over. It's not just an old stadium, he'd yell to anybody who'd listen. It's the beating heart of Rome. But more often than not, his pleas fell on deaf ears. Of course, being a man out of times has its perks. Marco knows things. He knows what the Colosseum looked like in its prime, the smell of blood and sweat and the deafening roar of the crowd. And because of that, he knows how to talk to people, how to weave stories, how to keep them hanging on every word. In the evenings, after a long day of negotiations and stone counting, he sits with other scholars in a dimly lit tavern drinking cheap wine and telling them of wild tales of gladiators and emperors as if he'd lived through it. Which, of course, he had. And let's not forget the tourists. They're starting to trickle in now, wandering through Rome in search of relics. Falcone becomes an official guide, taking these curious travellers to the Colosseum, spinning tales of ancient glory and secrets hidden in its stones. Sometimes he can't help but embellish. After all, who's going to fact-check a story from 1,000 years ago? The hardest part for Marco isn't the politics or the erosion of history. It's the sense that no one else understands. They see a ruin, he sees a kingdom, a world where he once held power. But now he watches as the sun casts long shadows over the broken walls. He knows his fight isn't with emperors or gladiators anymore. It's with time itself. Time that somehow he has always managed to outrun. And yet Marco persists. He may no longer be shaping the fate of men in his arena, but he is still in the fight. This time to preserve the memory of Rome that only he truly remembers. Fast forward to the 21st century, and our main man has a new name, Mark Falco. He's not a gladiator handler or a Renaissance artist anymore. He's just trying to survive the daily grind as a tour guide in the chaotic streets of modern Rome. The Colosseum, once a monument to bloodshed and glory, is now a massive overcrowded tourist trap. But for Falco, it's still home, just with more selfie sticks. Every morning, Mark rolls out of his bed, pulls on his standard issue Rome Tour polo shirt, grabs his bag and prepares for battle. Not with lions or gladiators, no, this is far worse. Today he faces hordes of tourists armed with maps, fanny packs and an insatiable curiosity about a place that they'll forget 5 minutes later. His duties lead a never-ending stream of wide-eyed tourists through the ancient ruins, dodging Vespa traffic, selfie stick welding influencers and the occasional street vendor aggressively hawking authentic Colosseum souvenirs made in China. His greatest challenge? Trying to explain 2,000 years of history in less than 30 minutes, while keeping the group entertained and on schedule. No small feat, considering half of them are more interested in finding the best gelato. The crowds? Oh, the crowds. Falco is used to crowds. He's seen the Colosseum packed with screaming Romans, but this is a different kind of madness. Tourists who wander off mid-tour, the ones who ask if the Colosseum is where Julius Caesar fought the lions, or those who seem genuinely offended by the lack of Wi-Fi among the ruins. Mark has learnt to smile through it all, but inside he wants to empty that 9mm magazine. And then there are the over-curious ones, the history buffs, who come here prepared with questions designed to stump him. What type of marble was used in the original seating? They ask with smug grins. Falco stares at them for a moment, fighting the urge to remind them that he's been here since the damn thing was built. And if he hears one more question about Julius Caesar, he might snap. Instead he smiles, rattles off some facts, and tells them the Colosseum isn't a place, it's an experience. And of course he sends them off to buy a €5 postcard. But it's not all bad. Mark Falco has a soft spot for Rome, even in its modern tourist-clogged form. He knows every brick, every arch, every secret tunnel beneath the Colosseum. He can still walk through with his eyes closed, remember the days when the roar of the crowd was as familiar to him as the beating of his own heart. Now, though the roar is replaced by the buzzing of drones, and instead of gladiators, it's a sea of tourists taking panoramic shots. In those quiet, rare moments, usually at dawn before the tourists descend, Falco stands in the shadow of the Colosseum and feels its weight of history pressing down on him. He's lived through empires and Renaissance, watched Rome burn and rise again. He's lived through empires and renaissances, watched Rome burn and rise again, and yet here he is, guiding people through the ruins of a life he once knew. But as much as he complains, Mark wouldn't have it any other way. He loves this city. He loves the Colosseum, no matter how many tourists try to ruin it. Every day he gets to tell the stories of ancient Rome, a place that lived in his bones. And though the challenges have changed, now more about dodging annoying tourists than wild animals, Falco, as ever, persists. After all, he survived worse. So with a smile, Mark looks out over the group of tourists, most of whom will never fully grasp the weight of history they're walking through. And as he starts the tour, he chuckles to himself. Let's begin, he says, at the heart of the greatest empire the world has ever known.